Hello and welcome to another Frontline recap. Now, I'm Philip Ingram. I present Frontline, but I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and commentator across the globe on all matters defence, security, terrorism, cyber, and anything else that people ask me to comment on. And you'll notice some differences in Frontline. We haven't done this recap for the last couple of weeks. That's because the production team have been elsewhere, sunning themselves in Greenland, if you can sun yourself in Greenland at this time of the year, and following other world events. But we're also doing some changes in the channel, and Frontline is going to be set up on its own channel. So if you've got subscription, please move it across to the new Frontline channel. It's not going to cost you any more. And you follow us on there. It's as ever with any of these sorts of things, it's going to take a little bit of time before everything settles down. So please bear with us. I've got a couple of things to introduce what's happened this week, and a couple of interviews that I want to point you at. But again, go back and watch all of our interviews this week because they're all absolutely fantastic. And as Ukraine and other world events from a military perspective seem to fall off the headlines with all the other disasters that are going on, it's important that you keep up to date, and we will always keep you up to date with the latest thinking. First bit of thinking that I want to show you is this is Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, and he's talking about trilateral talks. Have a look at this here.
On the question of the talks, they're today and tomorrow in Abu Dhabi. Look, the good news is that for the first time in a very long time, we have technical military teams from both Ukraine and Russia meeting in a forum that we'll also be involved with, and our experts, Steve Woodcoff and Jared Kushner will also be attending for part of that, and we think that's important. And look, I don't want to say talks alone are progress, but it's good that there's engagement going on. I would also caution everyone that on things like this, because there's a lot of sensitivities involved in it, progress is probably not going to be known, even via leaks, until we really have a breakthrough. Our goal is to remain committed. We've committed a year to this. We think we've made real progress. If you look at the checklist of open items that existed at this time last year and the checklist of open items that remain now in terms of reaching a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia, that list has been substantially diminished. That's the good news. The bad news is that the items that remain are the most difficult ones. And meanwhile, the war continues. So all I can say in that regard is that we are investing at a very high level a substantial amount of time and energy to this endeavor. We are going to continue to do everything we can to see if there's a breakthrough. We have 55 partners that we're hoping to enter into collaboration with. Many have already signed on. And the goal here is very simple. We all understand that having a reliable global supply chains and critical minerals and processed and finished materials are critical to everything we do, as I pointed out in my opening statements to the group. And I think this is a broader mistake made by the industrialized and developed world, as we all sort of fell in love with the design of these things, but forgot that in order to design something, you have to be able to build it, and in order to build it, you have to have the fundamental materials necessary to make it with. That's the key goal of a critical mineral supply, and today it's heavily concentrated in the hands of one country. And that lends itself to, at worst case scenario, being used as a tool of leverage in geopolitics, but it also lends itself to any sort of disruptions, like a pandemic or anything that could political instability. And I think there's a growing global recognition that we need to have supply chains for critical minerals that are reliable and diverse across the world. Some countries have a number of critical minerals that they have available to them in terms of mining, but just haven't been able to do it because a foreign competitor will come in, they'll gut the price, they'll undercut it through state subsidies and unfair practices, and so it becomes economically unviable to be able to explore for critical minerals. So it's why we've made it a priority. First, we try to lead by example in what we've done here in the United States. And that includes permitting reform that makes it easier to go into this industry on the critical minerals we have here domestically, but also the creating demand, which is what the President announced yesterday by the announcement of a strategic stockpile of critical minerals. But we understand that this is a global challenge that requires a global response. And so we're working here today to create a forum for that to happen. And part of this is this new initiative, Forge, which we described earlier. We've got a number of countries that have signed on to that and many more that we hope will do so. This afternoon, there'll be additional sessions led by Trade Representative Greer, who's going to present on a price floor mechanism, and that's designed to make sure that these commodities will never fall below a certain price so that they can become economically viable. The idea is to protect people's investments or investments in these sectors across the world. As far as critical minerals are concerned, look, that's a part of economic prosperity for Ukraine and its future. This war will end at some point, and when it does, Ukraine needs to be able to harness all of the resources of their country to be able to rebuild it. Ukraine has tremendous economic potential. It is a country that could probably double its GDP in the next decade with the right economic moves, and we certainly think that is a part of an enduring peace. And so a lot of work and thinking has gone into that ahead of time, and so that hopefully it will be able to be actioned on as soon as the war comes to a conclusion.
And in this, Marco Rubio is saying that the trilateral talks are productive, and whenever you're getting all sides together, in particular the Ukrainians and the Russians around the table, but with the Americans there able to act as a go-between where that's needed, then that is positive, because we have to remember that warfare is diplomacy by other means. It starts when diplomacy fails. It finishes when you get the conditions set to get back around the table again, whether that round the table is for a complete surrender or a compromise agreement between the different warring factions. That's something that is decided. And Rubio is saying it's productive. Zelensky is also saying it's productive. But the other thing that came out of this that interested me was Rubio was talking about there being a US-led critical minerals alliance. Now, the interesting thing in that is critical minerals is focusing on what Donald Trump was talking about with regard to Greenland. He's talked about that before with regard to Ukraine. And what's driving this very much is China's domination of the critical mineral market. They own about 90% of the economic output of critical minerals around the world, whether that be the mines themselves or the refining capability. And this is something that the Americans are very concerned about. They're looking at non-economic outputs for these critical minerals so that they can support US tech and in particular defence industries. This is something that hasn't gone away and won't go away. Next video I want to point you at, and it sort of ties in a little bit with the critical mineral bit, but also the relationship between Russia and China. And this is Putin and Xi Jinping agreeing on closer ties. Have a look at this here.
For the Russia-Chinese relationship, as one can say with confidence, any time of the year is spring. I would like to personally wish you, and through you, the whole friendly Chinese nation, a happy new year and the upcoming Spring Festival. The comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation between Russia and China are exemplary. This year we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Treaty of Good Neighbourliness and Friendly Cooperation, which is fundamental to our relationship. Its further implementation undoubtedly meets key interests of the peoples of our countries and contributes to the strengthening of holistic and truly comprehensive cooperation between Russia and China. Russia is among the leaders in energy suppliers to China. Our partnership in energy is mutually beneficial and truly strategic. We are engaged in an active dialogue over peaceful and the promotion of high-tech projects, including in manufacturing and space exploration. As for the international situation, cooperation between Moscow and Beijing in foreign policy remains an important stabilizing factor amid growing global turbulence. We are ready to keep working in the closest coordination on global and regional issues, both bilaterally and in all multilateral platforms. On such a pleasant and quite symbolic day, I am pleased to have an in-depth conversation with you in order to develop together a new grand plan for development of bilateral relations. It is important to use a historic opportunity to constantly deepen strategic cooperation and jointly shoulder the responsibilities of major powers to ensure continued development of Chinese-Russia relations along the right trajectory.
And those closer ties are coming in a number of different ways. Of course, the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, has been in China and has reiterated or emphasized on this occasion Russia's support for China's ambitions to take over Taiwan. Russia's always been on the fence beforehand, but this is somewhere where Shoigu has actually come off that fence and been much clearer. I think it shows the importance of the relationship that there is between Putin and Xi. Of course, it's Xi taking what he can from Russia and Putin relying desperately on Xi's support to continue his illegal war in Ukraine. So let's get into the interviews this week, and continuing on the theme of China and Russia, here's my interview with Ian Williams, who is a renowned journalist specialising in Russia, Ukraine, but in particular China, and have a look at what he has to say here.
Putin's aggression in Ukraine would simply not be sustainable without Chinese support. He's underwriting the war effectively, and he's doing that in several ways. Economically, by buying more Russian goods than ever, whether that be gas, hydrocarbons, by supplying China with consumer goods, technology, and of course through the provision of multi-purpose technology such as machine tools or drones, going very close to that line between military help and economic help. So Russia has a lot to be grateful for and is highly dependent upon China. Now, a quid pro quo will be Russian support for Taiwan. Russia's always been a little bit cautious about being too overt in its support for China over Taiwan, because it doesn't want to find itself tied up down there in any conflict that might emerge. But you saw before Christmas when the Japanese Prime Minister suggested that the security interests of Japan were parallel to those of Taiwan. And in fact, if Taiwan came under attack, she suggested that Japan would inevitably become involved. Now, China threw a predictable tantrum out that. I mean, one diplomat even suggested that the Prime Minister should have her head cut off. One Chinese diplomat in Japan. There was a show of force by China around Taiwan. And interestingly, it also involved Russian nuclear-capable bombers joining Chinese aircraft in a show of force not far from Japan. So I think that Russia feels obliged to show strong verbal support for China's claim over Taiwan in exchange for this increasing dependence that they do have on China.
Well, Japan doesn't have a good history with Russia. China doesn't have a particularly good history with Russia. But the regional tensions that there are growing as Chinese expansionism grows and its expansionism around the world. But also, as you say, Chinese support. Zelensky turned around and claimed that the Russian strikes that are hitting Ukrainian civilian targets and cities are being guided by Chinese satellite data. And therefore, if Beijing is providing the eyes for Russian missiles, surely the distance between lethal aid and dual-use technology that Xi Jinping has tried to be very careful about the boundary that he steps over. Surely that boundary has been well and truly not just stepped over but jumped over.
Yeah, I think it's been breached. That example is only one of many, with the provision of satellite information for targeting by the Russians. And a lot of technology, I mean, drones is an example. Drone technology is multi-use, but of course it's become a frontline weapon in multiple ways for Russia. And again, Chinese know-how, Chinese technology on the drone front are heavily involved in that. There's also been, of course, Chinese soldiers have been apprehended in Ukraine. China has sought to distance itself from these soldiers, implying that these are mercenaries and there's no official sanction there. But progressively, the so-called red line between provision of support of an economic and civilian technology variety and military support is being breached in multiple ways.
One of the old things about the Soviet Union was it became a huge arms supplier for many different countries around the world, and certainly any country where there was a despot leader, they have and still have old Soviet-style tanks and aircraft and all the rest. Do you think China's positioning itself to take over from that now that Russia is A, burning through all of its equipment, but B, the reality is people are seeing how poorly it is faring in modern warfare against the simplest of weapon systems, like a drone with an RPG strapped to it is destroying some of the latest Russian tanks. Whenever the Russians were saying that it could stop the NATO's best tanks in a frontal fight. That's just been proven wrong. And China's positioning itself to take on that global market.
I think it's already taking it on because China is a technological power, significant technological power, and as such it way outstrips Russia. I mean, Russia technologically is a minnow compared with China. And the world, especially the global south, as the poorer countries are often referred, wants Chinese technology. It doesn't want Russian technology. I think at the end of the Cold War, there was an arrangement whereby China needed weaponry, needed technology, and Russia desperately wanted somewhere to flog it, to keep its armaments industry alive. And China became a big customer. It also acquired covertly as well a lot of information about Russian arms, which it then copied. And China has emerged now with a formidable arms industry of its own, which in many areas is far superior to that of Russia. Russia still has the edge on some fronts, but China has emerged with a significant arms industry, and in terms of export is looking to erode in those markets where Russia used to be more dominant, because of course Ukraine is taking all the Russian bandwidth at the moment. You know, the weapons are needed on the Ukrainian front line, which are burning through them at a quite an alarming rate from Putin's perspective.
And in this, Ian and I discuss the relationship between China and Russia, and we discuss what it is that Xi Jinping will have as a hold over Putin, how important that relationship is to Putin, how much support he's getting from China, how vital that is to his war operation. Ian is one of the world's leading experts on this relationship between China in particular and Russia, but the Chinese influence. And we expand a little bit to look at China's ambitions and what's going on politically, of course, with there have been recent clear-outs of senior generals at high levels where some of them have been accused of being US spies passing nuclear secrets to the CIA. This is a good interview. I can't commend it more highly. And the next interview that I want to point you at is looking at the detail of what's going on in the peace settlements and stuff at the minute. And it's me talking with former Major General Chip Chapman. Have a look at this here.
This partial ceasefire that we sort of seem to have brokered apparently by Trump wasn't really that. And indeed, it was just really a tactical pause, and overnight on the 2nd and 3rd of February, we now seem to have seen, according to Zelensky, the largest number of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles used in the war, not the largest number in terms of the overall number of drones, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles used. So during the non-ceasefire, they've really just stockpiled stuff to use on the sort of clout, don't dribble method that we always talk about. And of course, they've done that overnight on the coldest day of the year. So I don't think we've really got anywhere. But let's sort of break some of those apart and therefore look at it really. So the partial ceasefire, as I see it, is not really a concession. It's a signal, and there are three signals behind that. The first one is we are reasonable if Ukraine accepts our core demands. Rubbish, but that's the way that they will see it. Secondly, that we can turn the violence on and off. And thirdly, Trump can sort of say that there is progress and that it's Ukraine that's the blocker. And only if they would only concede the Donbass, and we keep now quoting it's the size of Delaware. I'm not sure why they do that, because America would never concede Delaware to anyone. Then peace could be cemented. And that is the problem, I think, at the moment, that they're talking about land, the Americans, and indeed when when Trump was talking about the Gaza sort of situation, one of the phrases he used there was that I look at things through a real estate prism, and that is the real problem. This is not about real estate and territory, a land swap. This is about sovereignty from a Ukrainian perspective, and oil and water don't really meet. And that's the problem we've really got at the moment. So Russia will maintain its position of no concessions. America and Russia, in terms of the military and information domains, will maintain the pressure. And they hope that there's the reward is some sort of peace. And I don't think Trump really cares what that sort of peace is, just so he can wave a piece of paper and try and get a Nobel Peace Prize. While Ukraine suffers. But all this has to be again wrapped up then with the Russian intent, which is to have sustained offensive operations at the front and blackouts in the rear, hoping that it can break the Ukrainian will and force it to accept the Russian terms. There is also the sticking point because the Russian terms are still maximalist. It's not just, this notion from Dmitriev that the path of peace is conceding Donbass. It is far wider than that. It's all that stuff about denazification and demilitarization, aiming to break Ukrainian sovereignty and culture. That doesn't mean it would be next year, but you don't concede your vital ground in military terms, which is what the Donbass would be with the fortress cities, particularly of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which would give your enemy the tactical ability to come again at a time and place of their choosing.
But, once again, we're seeing Donald Trump being humiliated. He turned around and said when he introduced this sort of pseudo ceasefire that there would be no rockets or attacks until at least the 5th of February. And as you quite rightly described, we've had one of the largest ballistic and cruise missile attacks on Kyiv on the coldest night, or across Ukraine on the coldest night of the year. We've also seen in recent days, a drone attack on a bus in Dnipropetrovsk, which killed 12 miners. We've seen a civilian train being struck in Kharkiv. Is Putin deliberately trying to push the boundaries with Trump to see how far he can get? And why do you think Trump isn't responding and going, hang on, you're not keeping up to your side of the bargain. I'm going to come down hard on you.
Well, no one knows the mercurial mind of Donald Trump, and I think that's the problem. It seems to me that one of the key things I thought would be the key things was Lindsey Graham on the 6th of January saying that Trump had greenlit the sledgehammer sanctions at 500%. That would be very impactful on Russia in the same way that what could be impactful today is seemingly that the Americans have done a tariff deal with India, bringing the tariff down from 50% to 18% and looking to not sell Russian oil to India, and that oil being replaced by Venezuelan oil, for example. That could be impactful. But it's almost at the moment that we've got to the point where it's a sort of rerun of the November position where from Trump's perspective, it was, you've got 1 week to settle. So what would be interesting, I think, in Abu Dhabi this week is, again, whether it is give Donbass or there'll be no security guarantees. That seems to be the way the Americans are going at the moment. Again, part of that pressure strategy to reward Russia and get Ukraine to concede. We're no further down that line of trying to unblock that. And that's, as I said, to my mind, this is not a issue of land. It's that fundamental issue about sovereignty. But I think that is, of course, the real macro geopolitical problem, that Trump doesn't really look at things in terms of sovereignty. That's why we've had all the nonsense about Canada as the 51st state. And, Greenland I'll invade Greenland and it'll become the 52nd state. I mean, it's just... the chicken bones of the international order have been sort of thrown in the air. We're not quite sure where they're going to come down in the future. What we do know, of course, is that hard power matters. And that's what both Donald Trump and Putin have really shown in the last few years.
And Chip and I are old friends and colleagues. We have served together on operations, in a couple of different operations, and we commentate together across the world, and it's always good to catch up with them because we get this understanding of things from a military tactical perspective, and we can delve into the tactics as to what's going on. But looking at there was a ceasefire that Trump had agreed, and Putin seemed to have broken it. Now Trump seems to have rolled back on that and tried to change the conditions of the ceasefire. It was a week-long agreement that Putin said he was not going to attack Ukraine's critical infrastructure, and then they attacked on the coldest night of the year Ukraine's power infrastructure around Kyiv and other cities. So we delve into that and have a look at that and put into context the air war and the ongoing strikes against Kyiv, but also look at what's going on from a tactical perspective on the Eastern Front and how that is likely to develop over the next 18 to 24 months. Chip has got this fantastic way of describing what is going on today and bringing it into context with historical examples and other recent examples as well. So if you ever want to get a proper understanding of what's going on, listen to Chip and I talk, and this is a fantastic interview. As ever, I commend all of the interviews this week. Don't just watch these clips that are put out there. Go and watch the full long form interviews, because that'll give you a real and proper understanding. And there's some nuggets in all of them. But once again, thank you for watching. And please like and subscribe. Go to our new Frontline channel and make sure that you're properly subscribed in there. Put your comments in. And if you're subscribed, then I can answer your comments in the Q&A next week. But thank you for watching. Goodbye.